Happy Tuesday, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. In great mood again today. A lot of that here lately. Another big commit for UGA. Very interesting goings-on at spring practice. Connor Riley later on to kind of give us the latest on all of that. Interesting stuff all the way around. Good times, and glad to have you with us. So what do you say we do this? Let's talk off the top about Jordan James, UGA commitment, what there is to like about the four-star running back, specifically one thing in particular that we will get to on all of that. And as I said before, hopefully we'll make this a lot of fun for all of you. I certainly appreciate you stopping by to see us. DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So Georgia gets another commit for its 2022 class. This was a guy that had eyes on him for a while, Jordan James, running back out of the state of Tennessee. He had put out on Twitter a couple of weeks ago or so that he was ready to make his commit. There had been some online chatter that commitment might come to Georgia. Then lo and behold, yesterday afternoon, he does kind of drop this out of the sky, committing to Georgia. In fact, let me show you here on social media how James himself made that official. Really good-looking edit there with his Oakland High School uniform on. You see Harry Dog, you see UGA, and you see a very nice committed graphic down there for James coming to UGA. Admittedly, this is not a player that we have talked about as much in this 2022 cycle on this show as maybe we've talked about with some other prospects. So it was kind of fair for many folks to ask, well, what is Georgia getting in Jordan James here? James' overall ranking maybe not as high as a lot of the other players that we do talk about, including the last two commits that have come in just the last week's time for UGA. So a lot of folks were saying, hey, what does this mean for Georgia? What are you getting in James? Despite the fact that James put up gigantic numbers in his most recent season there at Oakland, and obviously Del McGee's scout's eye for these kinds of running backs has proven to be pretty spectacular. There was still some curiosity about overall exactly what this means for Georgia to be able to go into Tennessee and get a running back like Jordan James. So let me see if I can kind of sum this up this way, because for those of you who are just now kind of getting acquainted with James, wondering what all the fuss is about, how he fits into the plans for Georgia, obviously we have talked about other running backs here. If you want to care about why James matters for UGA, and if you're just getting plugged in on this story and you kind of want to talk about, why this is good for Georgia, maybe the most prominent reason of all is how mad it is making some of the fans of one of your rivals here of this program. Georgia's obviously got a lot of rivals. Tennessee is clearly one, and there's some upset folks around Vol fandom these days related to the fact that Georgia swoops into the Murfreesboro area and comes out with Jordan James here. In fact, let me just read you one of these tweets. There's a bunch of this social media activity. We're kind of turning over a new leaf here on this show. We're not going to dox opposing fans on the show when we can help it. So I'm not going to show you any of these, but I want to just read you one in particular that kind of sums up the feeling of Vols fans related to Jordan James' commitment to Georgia. It says that he's a shifty runner. It'll be fun to watch in Athens, but the Tennessee fan here says, this is yet another whiff for Josh Heupel on 2022 in-state products. So this is really the center of this for Tennessee fans, message board, social media, everything else. Josh Heupel apparently made big promises about what Tennessee was going to do in state recruiting, and here Georgia swoops in, takes a prospect. Tennessee fans have been used to this now for a number of years of not only having a hard time keeping pace with the very best of SEC recruiting all the way around, but in particular just keeping their own players in state. The high-profile misses for Tennessee, pretty prominent. And by the way, for like the North Georgia area where a lot of folks may have grew up Tennessee fans, they've had a hard time recruiting those guys as well. And under Josh Heupel had kind of gone around the state saying it's going to be different. We're going to stop me if you've heard this before. Heupel saying we're going to build a fence around our border and we're going to keep the best products in our state in the state of Tennessee. We're not going to let them escape out. We're going to build a border. If you don't believe me on this, or if you just want to know why Tennessee fans are disappointed, many of them anyway, to see Jordan James now a part of UGA's 2022 class, let's go back and listen to one of the promises that Josh Heupel made when he was first hired by the Vols. Take a listen to this.
He's pouring time and energy into the specific players. that are inside of the state. I think it's really important that you develop relationships, as families first and foremost, but it's developing high school relationships with high school coaches. If you can do that, they're going to trust you and they're going to respect you, and then you got an opportunity to go recruit the biggest and best here inside the state of Tennessee.
Yeah, and that's kind of the collective reaction to all Vols fans here today of better luck next time when it comes to going after one of the players you really target there. But to be serious about this just for a moment, though. Oakland is one of the, there you go. Good to see Jordan James kind of launching in on this, by the way, saying feels good to be a dog on the heels of what you just heard from Josh Heupel there. Even more painful for many Tennessee fans to see Jordan James saying feels good to be a dog, but fun stuff all the way around there on that. And to be serious here for a moment, Tennessee is not necessarily, this is not a shot, this is just an objective evaluation. The state of Tennessee is not necessarily known as a hotbed for high school football recruiting. There are not a million prospects in that state every year. This year may be a year where it's a little deeper than normal, but in almost any year, though, in which there are elite prospects, and there are always a few, James High School there at Oakland is one of the high schools there, along with say Blackman, Maryville maybe, that kind of produce big players each and every year. So while Tennessee is trying to figure out what, shoes to put on which feet here, trying to reboot the entire program in the Josh Heupel era here, there is a chance to make inroads in that state to get the very best in that state, and Jordan James could be a step forward on that because his high school there at Oakland, they're always going to have players, and this part of the state is the kind of part of the state that does kind of produce these players from time to time. So this is, in addition to getting a good running back in Jordan James, maybe a chance for Georgia to plant a little bit of a flag in Tennessee, just related to the reboot going on there with the Vols and Josh Heupel. And obviously, the takeaway from Heupel's part of all of this is, listen, you can talk a big game about what you're going to do from a recruiting standpoint, but it's all easier said than done. Catching up to the rest of the SEC, not just Georgia, but the rest of these programs who are obviously trying to be well established in terms of their recruiting apparatus, not an easy thing to do. Georgia getting Jordan James, a reminder of that. And by the way, the Dogs who have been red hot, just absolutely smoking hot on the recruiting trail, this continues here with James. Go back and watch his film. Look at the stats. Nearly 10 yards a carry, huge numbers that he put up last season there in a high school in the state of Tennessee. Big get for the class of 2022. And for Georgia, as the saying goes, they may not be done yet by a long shot, with more big names to come here in the very near future. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and glad to have you with us no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, Radio Noon, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast platforms, the Apple Player, Google Player, worldfamousDawgNation.com. We post the show. I do have to apologize yesterday. This was not an intentional act on my part, but when I did post the show at DawgNation.com yesterday, all the preview of what's going to be in the show, one thing that was not there was the actual show itself. If you go back and check that post now, you can find the podcast. Thanks to those who pointed it out to me, and my apologies for what was an unforced error on my part yesterday. But you can listen to the show by clicking into the post on most days there at DawgNation.com when I have my act together and do it correctly as I should. Of course, many of you listen right there through SoundCloud there as well. The point is, no matter how you get to us, really appreciate you being here, and I want to just give a sincere thank you as well to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia for making it all possible. When it comes to two big issues that homeowners deal with, foundation issues, waterproofing issues, ESOG is ready to step up to the plate for you and do great work for you. They're proud partners of UGA, which means they're fun to do business with. It's always nice to support a company that supports UGA. They've been great friends of ours here at DawgNation for a long time here on DawgNation Daily, and I'm eternally grateful for those of you that want to support those that have supported our program. And I can also, with great confidence, recommend them for your issues because they are a solutions-based company. That means that you got a small problem, they'll just give you a simple fix for that small problem. But when it comes to those cracks that show up in your foundation, the water that creeps in when it rains, those at times can be more substantial fixes. And another reason to trust ESOG, they have two full-time engineers on staff, really smart people doing really good work. So reach out to them. Give them a call. Simply dial 678-ESOG now. That is 678-ESOG now, and that'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, we're going to do Connor Riley here in just a little bit. Obviously, Connor's going to have a lot to say about the recent run of success for UGA recruiting. Connor was in the room the other day when five-star athlete Malachi Starks made his Georgia pledge, and following closely along with Jalen Walker on Sunday, and now Jordan James there as well. So we'll do all of that with Connor. He also has a really good piece up this morning at DawgNation.com kind of what we've learned from spring practice thus far. So Connor will give us a lot of that here coming up over the course of the next few minutes. But before we get that, I want to talk about the Georgia offense here for a moment, because we have talked about this a lot lately. But I thought that Georgia tight end John Fitzpatrick, when he met with the reporters the other day, said something really interesting. He was kind of asked about the role the tight ends, the wide receivers, those pass-catching targets going to play for Georgia this year, how they're going to kind of come together. And it was certainly interesting as we go around the doghouse here that, he's saying these things, kind of prior to knowing, or at least we weren't aware yet of what was happening with George Pickens. But, he's kind of talking about these things, saying these things. And what he said certainly sounds like music to the ears of Georgia fans who hope that Georgia can, as we've been saying on this show now for a number of days, can utilize these great crop of pass catchers, even in the absence of George Pickens with his injury, can utilize all of this to the tune of the offensive success that the Bamas and the LSUs, the Clemsons, the Ohio States, those very best programs in college football the last couple of years have been able to do. Obviously, big-time years from pass catchers, a big part of that, and certainly John Fitzpatrick, who could play a role in all of that, he certainly seems to be keenly aware of this. This is what he said.
We're just excited, and we're eager, and we're hungry. We all have a bunch of experience, I feel like, and we just want to use that experience, and we don't want to be sitting there watching when it comes to January. We want to be playing in those games.
Yeah, obviously that's exactly what Georgia fans want too, playing in the biggest games. And as I've written, as I've talked about, and as I said before, the pathway towards doing that, playing in the biggest games and having success once you get there, it would seem to be fueled and powered by a high-powered offense, a dominant offense that scores the 40-plus points a game. And obviously, there's a lot of tension in a conversation like this because in addition to Georgia's, and let's just face it, last couple of years, you'd have to describe it as inability to do that, simultaneous to Georgia's struggles in that regard, you have seen arch nemesis type programs, the kinds of teams that Georgia fans hate, like Alabama and others who have seemingly made scoring points look so easy. And so I certainly have great respect for the people who are charged with fixing this at Georgia, how frustrating it must be to, have to have this narrative kind of thrown back up in your face over and over again. And with that, all that being said, I think it's also fair to point out the ways in which Nick Saban, the Alabama coach, who clearly has overseen an incredible offensive overhaul at Alabama these last few years, how it is that he seems to be going out of his way to do as much as he possibly can to remind folks just how much the Alabama's offense has changed, and maybe by comparison kind of causing folks to think about what hasn't happened yet at a place like Georgia. We've always said, listen, everything that Nick Saban says is for a reason. It's intentional. When he goes and speaks to the media, he's trying to send a message to somebody, his own players or whomever else, but there's always a careful calculation around every word that Saban uses. So with that in mind, and on the theme here of offensive overhauls, what needs to happen at Georgia, what has happened other places, there's a video that's been passed around the internet over the course of the last week or so. And the honest truth is, I'm not exactly sure what the original, genesis of all this was. I think it's like a coaching clinic type thing, not Saban speaking with reporters necessarily, but it's certainly been used by a lot of media types of Saban being as open and honest and kind of wide-ranging as you're ever going to hear him in any kind of comments that he delivers, talking about the way in which, and this is not the first time he said it, but it may be the most emphatic way in which he stated the ways in which that his offensive philosophy, what he used to believe about football, is just not the way the sport is anymore. And when you hear Saban say things like this, it's easy to think about, Fitzpatrick and all those other Georgia players working really hard to join Alabama in what is undeniably an offensive revolution. If you haven't heard Nick Saban on this, if you've missed this on the internet, this is what he has said as of late that's gotten a lot of attention.
The game is different now. People score fast. I grew up with the idea that you play good defense, you run the ball, you control vertical field position on special teams, and you're going to win. Whoever rushes the ball the most for the most yards is going to win the game. You're not going to win anything now doing that, because the way the spread is, the way the rules are to run RPOs, the way the rules are that you can block downfield and throw the ball behind the line of scrimmage. I mean, those rules have changed college football. And no huddle fastball has changed college football. So I changed my philosophy about 5 or 6 years ago. It was more than that. When Lane came here, we said we got to outscore him.
So, as I said before, I believe that everything that Saban says is for a purpose. I believe statements like that are for a purpose there as well, and I do think he wants to draw a contrast between his program that has evolved completely offensively and programs, in this case, unfortunately, like Georgia, that haven't quite done that yet. And what he's kind of creating, at least in the sense of Georgia, is what a salesperson would call a double bind. Like a good salesperson knows how to like sort of throw a double bind out there. Hey, would you like to meet Tuesday at 2, Thursday at 4? Either choice you make, you're meeting with this salesperson, and that's just what good salespeople know how to do. This is kind of Saban's own version of that double bind. If you're Kirby Smart, you either have to admit that, yes, we're trying to follow in the footsteps that Alabama has already been down, which kind of reaffirms another narrative that seems to exist about, Kirby Smart in relationship to Alabama. Or you have to say, no, we don't believe Nick Saban is true, that we are capable of doing things the way that we've done it and not being exactly the way that Alabama has been, which is also kind of a double bind that favors Saban because frankly, it's difficult to argue that anything that Saban says there is incorrect when you see the way in which prolific offenses have just sort of taken over and dominated the sport. So Saban's words there are a problem, I would say, for programs like Georgia, but I don't think it changes the overall the imperative nature of figuring out a way to match exactly what Nick Saban describes. Because of the way in which RPOs are kind of not officiated or officiated, however you want to say that, because of all of that, you might as well just sort of get with it. You might as well just sort of join everybody else in these 42-point per game offensive performances and outscore your opponent as a way of trying to figure out a way to go out there and win championships. It's a very interesting statement from a coach like Nick Saban, and obviously it adds emphasis to whatever may be going on around Georgia spring practice right now. As Georgia, through its offensive coordinator hire, Todd Monken going into his second year, through its firmly entrenched starting quarterback JT Daniels, and in spite of an injury to one of its best players, wide receiver George Pickens, Georgia trying to figure out a way to do exactly what Nick Saban describes there. Interesting stuff really coming in from a couple of fronts there around the SEC. That is Around the Doghouse. Before I bring on Connor Riley, let me give you a quick shout out to my friends who tune in to watch us on YouTube each and every day. And for those of you who have made the decision to become a DawgNation YouTube subscriber, such a great way for you to stay up to date on everything happening around DawgNation, to go deep, get those notifications sent to you when we go live, to watch you just heard John Fitzpatrick a moment ago, all the press conference stuff coming out of UGA. You can get all of that by becoming a subscriber to the DawgNation YouTube page, including all the great shows like the one you're watching right now, DawgNation Daily, presented by ESOG. Thanks for subscribing to us on YouTube. Thanks for setting those notifications for when we go live so we can show up right there on your device. We really appreciate that. All right, later on, before we're done, one of the big commitments from Georgia as of late, the 4-star linebacker Jalen Walker said something very interesting Sunday during his ceremony that caught some Georgia fans off guard. I'll share that with you before we're done here today and explain why that's maybe a good thing for the Dogs. We will talk about that. But for now, on everything related to UGA recruiting, what's happening with spring practice, and everything else in between, let's do a Kroger Fresh Take with our buddy Connor Riley.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So Kroger Fresh Take here with Connor Riley. We'll get into a moment about all the things going on at Georgia spring practice and the attempt to build this offense, make it as powerful as what programs like Alabama have been, now without the wide receiver like George Pickens to be a weapon at Georgia's disposal. So we'll do a lot of that here coming up in just a couple of minutes. Before that, though, Connor, something that's undecidedly good news. The run of success that Georgia has had in recruiting as of late. 5-star name like Malachi Starks going back to Thursday. Jalen Walker, a linebacker, on Sunday. Jordan James, the running back, in the fold yesterday. James may be the most surprising of the group in the fact that it wasn't a scheduled commitment announcement. This 2022 class of the Dogs is really heating up, and all these guys are all seemingly saying the right things about even adding more big-name prospects. And boy, just even prior to the opening up of visits, which is going to happen later on this summer, there is a lot of energy around this 2022 class for Georgia right now.
Yeah, and I think the thing that has to encourage you the most right now is where these two last commitments, Jordan James yesterday, Jalen Walker on Sunday, have come from. Mm-hmm. They're out-of-state guys. And, over the course of the pandemic, Georgia made, I think, a very concerted effort to recruit more in-state because they could not rely and lean on going out of state and in convincing players to come play at Georgia without really getting a chance to show it off. And so the fact that you're still able to go and beat a Clemson to land a Jalen Walker, to go beat a Tennessee and land a Jordan James, I think says a lot about how this staff is still able to recruit. And to me, it's going to be an interesting test. Once visits do open up, what sort of route does Georgia go? Do they continue to sort of build those in-state relationships because they have built those over Zoom and really over the past year, or do they eschew back to what they were doing in the 2019 and 2020 cycles where they were relying more on out-of-state talent, where sometimes it's a little bit better, but you do have to go out and win more contested recruitments?
Yeah, in the case of Walker and Starks, what I'll also add to that there as well is, listening to those guys talk about Georgia, why they chose Georgia, even in Walker's case, really not having those face-to-face conversations with coaches the way we typically think of as kind of the finishing touch on a lot of these recruitments. Man, you don't really find better spokesmen for Georgia than what both these guys kind of provide. So in addition to getting – I'm including those two because I don't know as much about James, admittedly. But when it comes to, the way these guys are talking about Georgia, the things they're saying, not only are you getting great players in the field, at least potentially, but you're getting strong additions to the Georgia locker room there as well, and the kind of guys that you could very easily envision contributing positively to team chemistry in the seasons to come.
Yeah, and Starks and Walker already have, I think, a really strong relationship, and I don't know if Jeff dropped this on his appearance on Friday, but Malachi told him more specifically that the guy that he was really talking to and really working on Thursday of who might be next, who is he going after, was Jalen Walker, and they had already formed a really strong bond there, and so for the two of them to come together and get them back-to-back and beat out Clemson, a team that Georgia's going to continue to recruit more and more against in the years to come, especially as they start playing on the field. They play this season and then 2024 when Starks and Walker will be juniors. That's going to be really important and really interesting to see how Georgia, specifically against Clemson, who, other than Georgia, no program has recruited the metro Atlanta area better. It'll be interesting to see how Georgia and Clemson continue to go head-to-head in recruiting in the days and months to come.
What do you think about Jordan James as a player? The stats, obviously, are eye-popping. The highlight films to go with it. You would obviously expect good highlights for a guy who put up those kinds of stats. Oakland, as I mentioned during the top of the show, is a pretty long-standing, successful program there in that part of Central Tennessee. What do you think of James as a player?
Well, I think we have to trust Del McGee and his evaluation skills at this point because, sure, he is not rated to say a James Cook, Zamir White, Kendall Milton, a number 179 overall prospect. Kenny McIntosh was in that similar rating zone. Dejon Edwards was actually ranked a little bit lower than that. And those guys both came in and proved to be very capable and SEC-level running backs. And I think James can absolutely be that same. I do think that Georgia is going to try and take two running backs. Obviously, Branson Robinson, the big name to know now. But it does make things a little bit easier going forward and at least a little more comforting knowing that you have a guy like Jordan James who's already such a proven product and someone who had multiple SEC-level offers.
I mean, listen, I have a lot of respect for the audience, so because of that, I want to be as candid as I possibly can. In the case of McIntosh and Edwards they both turned out to, when I saw them play at Georgia, be way better than I assumed they would be. And that's not disrespectful to Kenny, nor is it disrespectful to Dejon. It's just that there is a idea you have in your mind of what a player rated at this level is supposed to be, especially at a time in which Georgia's recruiting, recruiting prospects with like double-digit numbers next to their name, or in some cases single-digit numbers next to their name. Someone who's kind of in the top 200 is a little bit different type of thing for Georgia. But Kenny McIntosh is a splendid athlete.
Yeah.
I thought he was going to be kind of a bruiser, goal line type running back. That's not what he is at all. He's much better athletically than I realized he was. And Dejon Edwards, in kind of some mop-up duty, admittedly, but still on the field last year against SEC competition, was toting the rock very well. So, I mean, I guess at this point in time, I do just trust what Del McGee. If Del McGee wants to bring a guy in, my assumption is the guy he wants to bring in must be a Georgia running back.
Yeah, I mean, we all know Georgia wanted and had a commitment from John Emery Jr. in that 2019 cycle, but I think looking at their careers right now, I think Kenny's been the better running back, and it just happened to work out circumstantially with how that worked out there. But again, I think you just have to trust Del McGee in his evaluations at this point. Kendall Milton could have gone anywhere. Alabama, Ohio State, LSU. He chose Georgia. Georgia went out for him. Zach Evans, Georgia did technically win that recruitment, but we don't need to go into why and how that ended. And to get a guy like Edwards after that blowed up so spectacularly, I think shows just the all-around ability that Del McGee has as a recruiter and identifier of talent.
But it is fair. I mean, if you're just going to keep it real and have honest talk here, it is really fair to point out that of the high-profile running back misses for Georgia, 5 stars who got away, Zach Evans, Trey Sanders, John Emery Jr., Georgia hasn't really lost face by not signing any of those guys yet. Listen, Trey may be a good player. He's just been hurt. I think that John Emery Jr. is still going to be a pretty good player for LSU. He showed some flashes a little bit last season, and honestly, I really don't know how Zach Evans is doing in Fort Worth. I haven't followed that as well as maybe I could have or should have. But he hasn't done well enough for me to hear much about it. Is the point here? But the overall larger point is the Evans, Sanders, Emery misses. There hasn't been much of a reason to really view those as misses based on what those guys have done in college as of yet.
Right, and obviously I think the other name we have to mention there is Tank Bigsby.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Georgia chose to prioritize Zach Evans there, and that is why Bigsby is ultimately ending up at Auburn. But Kendall Milton is the most beloved running back and maybe even one of the best, most beloved players on this team right now, and I think there are a lot of people interested and exciting to see what he does going forward. And, Milton, Bigsby, again, Georgia is still very well set up. So long as Del McGee is still the running backs coach in Georgia, Georgia is going to be just fine in both running back recruiting and running back production.
But this doesn't matter, and there's stuff that does matter we need to talk about. But I do want to just check your police work there just for a little bit. Georgia did not deprioritize Bigsby because of Milton, right? Milton said he wanted to play with Bigsby.
Correct.
They deprioritized Bigsby for Zach
Evans.
Evans. Now, if Tank Bigsby goes on to have a great career at Auburn, that is a decision that's fair to second guess on Georgia's part at that point.
Yeah, certainly understandable. And it's not, again, you can't, I don't think the comparison is between Milton and Bigsby. I think it is more between Evans and Bigsby. And obviously when Georgia was recruiting Evans, we had sort of known, this is sort of who he was. And I don't know if troubled recruitment is the right word, but high-profile recruitment, a lot of drama in there. Georgia sort of knew what it was getting into in there, and for it to end up the way that it did shouldn't have been all that surprising there.
And just last thing, and I'll move on. Obviously, I was the conductor on the Zach Evans hype train. I mean, I'll certainly admit that. But I've also said a million times is like I would have been happy with Tank Bigsby there as well.
Yeah.
And so if you could have had him, then maybe you should have taken him. But the point is the running backs that Georgia has signed certainly look to be very good.
Yeah, absolutely. This is still going to be a position of strength in 2021, I should say, and probably even 2022, even as I think Zamir White and James Cook move on after this season.
So let me transition to what's going on with spring practice. You obviously have a really good piece up at DawgNation.com that's really very thorough in kind of breaking down a lot of this. And the thing we can't seem to get away from on this show is that need to upgrade offensively. Nick Saban almost taunting Georgia by describing the massive overhaul of his mindset about what needs to be done offensively around college football. And for Georgia, the task of doing that now harder because of the George Pickens injury. Not impossible, but certainly harder. You and I haven't talked about the Pickens injury yet on this show, but in light of that injury and light of what Georgia needs to do, what's the landscape around Georgia spring practice right now because of all of that?
So years ago, famous book. Do you remember why Billy Beane sort of did the Moneyball thing, relied on analytics, and sort of transitioned his franchise and really all of sports since then into going about functioning in that manner? Do you know why he did all that?
Because he was a failed prospect?
Not exactly, but
that was part of the story.
That's part of the Moneyball story. I like that there. His original goal was to try and replace the production of Jason Giambi, Johnny Damon, and Jason
guys the A's could not afford to
because
re-sign.
the A's could not afford to re-sign them. Georgia right now cannot afford another George Pickens. There just is not another player like them. In this circumstance, he is the Jason Giambi. There is no true replacement for Jason Giambi. But what I think Todd Monken, who is the Billy Beane in this situation, is now going to go about doing is replacing the production that Pickens would have brought to this team, which if you want to use the last 4 games where JT Daniels was a quarterback and put that over a 12-game season, it's roughly 1,200 yards, 70 catches, and 12 touchdowns. So 12 touchdowns is probably the thing that's going to be the hardest to replace. And while I love Moneyball and the story, and it's a fantastic book, part of the problem with that is every time the A's get to the postseason, they lose simply because the math works out over the course of a 162-game season, but when you need to win one big game, sometimes it just really helps that you have those players that can make a difference in a one-at-bat scenario, and Pickens ultimately is that. So the thing I'm going to be interested in is how does Todd Monken now go about dividing up Pickens's potential production, and where does that go to? Do the yards go more to Jermaine Burton? Do the touchdowns go to Darnell Washington a little bit more? I think that's the thing that we're going to see and hear over these next couple of weeks, and I'm really interested to see how that goes about going.
So I think the Moneyball comparison here is a really good one because There is a lot of precedent in college football for clearly wide receivers being very important, but not every great wide receiver was also a great recruit. Right. I wrote about this and talked about this a little bit. Go back to 2019, the last full year of college football, when everybody was playing the full complement of games. Of the Power 5 teams that averaged 40 or more points per game, only Clemson from 2019 had a former 5-star as their leading receiver from that year. There were, Alabama had Jerry Jeudy as their number 2 receiver. LSU had Terrace Marshall as their number 3 receiver. But programs like Ohio State and Oklahoma did not have former 5-star receivers among their top 3. But Oklahoma did have a walk-on among its top 4. And I think Ohio State was led by a former 3-star receiver there in that 2019 season. So 5-star receivers are clearly important. George Pickens has proven that over the course of his 2 years at Georgia. But there are other ways to skin a cat, as my family would have said when I was growing up. You can have 5-star level production from non-5-star level prospects if your quarterback is good enough and if your offensive coordinator is locked in as well as he possibly can be.
And Jermaine Burton was not a 5-star receiver. It's clear he was still one of the best wide receiver prospects. And if you look at the traditional freshman wide receiver production of top 100 recruits, he blew that out of the water with what he did a season ago. I think Arian Smith is another guy who it's clear he's got talent and can make an impact. And if there's anyone that benefits now from the extra targets that go around, I figure it might mostly be him, just simply because you can maybe see him from a guy who, if we were trying to do the math, maybe you get him to 25 catches over the course of the year. Now there's a potential for that to be even higher now that you don't have Pickens. And really, I think as you saw in that Peach Bowl game against Cincinnati, he's going to be the guy who's your true downfield threat. So I think with all of this, Georgia still has a ton of talent in both that wide receiver room and in that tight end room. I think they're going to be, over the course of the full 12-game season, I think they're going to be just fine on offense. It's the ultimate question is, in that big game, say, against Alabama in SEC championship game, that first game of the year against Clemson, if we're willing a college football playoff here. Do you know the last 3 national title games, the winning team has all had a wide receiver that had at least 150 yards receiving in that game?
Yeah.
That's the kind of player that George Pickens was, and that's not to say that Jermaine or Arian Smith, whoever, Kyrus Jackson, can't become that player. It's just right now Georgia I don't think has that player on their team.
So if you go back to, say, 2019 when Lawrence Cager got hurt, and he was hurt for part of that season, even with Pickens and Blaylock having very good freshman years, there just wasn't enough talent to make up for Cager. Yeah. Even if Cager's healthy, Georgia still wasn't great at the receiver position, but once he got hurt and was spent part of that season hurt, the whole idea of next man up, there just was no next man. There wasn't enough quality receiver play to fill that void. It remains to be seen what's going to happen for Georgia in 2021, but the scenario on paper is far different. Georgia does have the measurable talent where it could possibly overcome the loss of George Pickens. Doesn't mean they will, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's easy, but compared to any other year in the Kirby Smart era, and frankly probably any other year for Georgia, going back a number of years in the past, this team at least has enough measurable talent at receiver where the idea of replacing what George Pickens provides is at least a statistical possibility.
Yeah, and I think Cortez Hankton here deserves some bit of credit for helping get this wide receiver room to where, especially over these last 2-3 cycles, that 19 one where they signed Pickens and Blaylock, and then the one after where they signed the 5 wide receivers that they did, of just turning that wide receiver around so quickly to where, it's not like Alabama was or maybe even LSU or Clemson, but it is clear if you're stacking up wide receiver rooms in the country, there aren't very many you would prefer to have over even this current one without Pickens for the potential of the entire 2021 season.
I want to ask about the other side of the ball here in just a moment. Before that, let me remind you, this is our Kroger Fresh Take with our buddy Connor Riley right now, and obviously the folks at Kroger are getting ready for Easter. Man, let me tell you something. I'm so excited about the big day this Sunday. Such a different landscape for this year's Easter compared to what it was a year ago. People able to kind of get together a little bit more in a healthy and safe way. The vaccines are obviously rolling out. Some folks able to attend church in person where maybe they weren't able to do that last Easter. Whatever you're planning on doing for the big day, the point is that Kroger's got you covered for all of it, whether it's getting stocked up for those things that go in the Easter basket, the candy, the eggs, everything else, or the food for the big meal, the recipe ideas you may need to cover all of that. Kroger can just give you all kinds of input on all of that. It's Kroger.com/fresh. You can find out about your local store, or go to Kroger.com/Easter, and you can find out specifically about the things going on right right there in your area at the Kroger in your neighborhood, getting ready for Easter. Kroger.com/Easter. Make sure you check that out today. So, Connor, you used a phrase in your story that I thought was really interesting. The idea of emerging names on defense. Boy, I love emerging names. It's always a lot of fun. Give us an idea right now who you think those emerging names might be.
So the two that to me have so far jumped out the most in terms of what we know, or at least what the expectations are from Kirby Smart, are names that we've known and talked about specifically on this show for a while, largely just because of the recruiting prowess. But it's Trayvon Walker and Nakobe Dean. You're someone that's pointed out this a million times. When you're listening to Kirby Smart speak, it's the guys that he brings up unprompted that you really need to pay attention to. It's not so much who the reporters like myself are asking about. It is more who does he bring up without, who are the guys that he wants to talk about. I thought when he was asked about Nolan Smith and he goes off on a tangent talking about Trayvon Walker, that's your bells and whistles. Hey, they're expecting a lot out of Trayvon Walker, specifically in a way that traditionally was never expected out of Malik Herring going forward. And then the other guy that has really caught my attention is Nakobe Dean, because he's been brought up by multiple guys already of someone who's really emerged as a leader, and we know what he can do on the football field. And the fact that he's getting this talked about and raved about when he can't even physically go through practice right now says a lot to me about those two guys and how important they're going to be to this defense in 2021.
So two things here really quick. Folks, time passes, people forget, but the stuff that people liked about Jalen Walker on Sunday is exactly what Nakobe Dean was like as a recruit. And the stuff that people liked about Malachi Starks going back to Thursday, that's what Nakobe Dean was there too. One of those guys that just seemed to have, at least based on the way that he's talking about all of his process, just seemed to have a really good head on his shoulder, and you sort of immediately saw him as a good locker room guy as well as a good football player. That's what Dean was advertised as coming in, and I think he has been as advertised throughout his couple of years at Georgia. So the idea that he's leading from the sidelines, I would say to you and me both, is not a surprise at all.
No, it is not. And he's, again, the next Roquan Smith comparisons are always going to sort of follow him. Just given
it's tough. It's an unfair thing.
That's what he walked
on
into.
On a small scale level, that's the next Jordan thing that has plagued so many basketball players. In our little small world of UGA football, constantly tabbing some linebacker with like the next Roquan label is really unfair for those guys.
And he has done about as incredible of a job as you can of living up to those expectations as can be expected at this point. From a statistical standpoint, he is right on track with where Roquan is. Now, I'm not saying he's going to go become Roquan, and I don't even know if a linebacker anymore is capable of having the impact that Roquan Smith did in 2017, just given offenses in college football have changed so much in the last 3 seasons. But I think he's a crucial piece of this defense and really a crucial all-around leader for this program. And, teams take after their leaders, and if this team takes after Nakobe Dean, I think that's a really good thing for this Georgia football program.
And see, the thing about Trayvon Walker, I'll say, is that people love to make college football and just football in general sound really complicated. They like to use football language, A-gaps and 5 techniques, and people just like to make it really complicated. But there is an element of the sport that's always going to be really simple, that if you had the freedom to just walk around, the Georgia football facility and you just saw the players, you saw Trayvon Walker, obviously he's one of the best players. Yeah. He stands up, big, tall posture, big guy, confident. Clearly, he's one of the best players. Anybody who would look at him would look at him and say, that guy obviously looks like he'd be very good at football. And even after a couple of years of people kind of getting used to him, and he's not the, the novelty that he once was when he arrived on campus as a 5-star recruit, this is still one of the Georgia's most valuable players, and maybe from a statistical standpoint it's backed up this year, but if you just saw him walking around campus, it would be obvious to your eyes that he is an incredibly valuable football player.
He's first-team all-bus, first-team guys you want walking off the bus to intimidate the other team. And again, you go back to our first real introduction to Trayvon Walker. It wasn't, if you wanted to the larger fan base that doesn't pay attention, it was probably that game-ending sack against Auburn. But to the watchers of DawgNation Daily, seeing a man that size run down on kickoff is something I had not seen in a long time, and I have a feeling it's not something we're going to see regularly going forward. He is just a truly special athlete. And again, Malik Herring was a great player with what he was asked to do in Georgia. But there are just not many college football prospects across the past decade that can do or have the potential to do what Trayvon Walker does because of his size, speed, and strength. He is truly, I think, a special player, and I really hope that we get to see him unleash this season and wreck games in a way we haven't really seen from him.
I think that's all really true. I want to squeeze in one more thing before we're done. You name-check Tyke Smith in your piece there as well. Transfer defensive back from West Virginia. This is a guy that's got real credentials. A couple different outlets said him as an All-American. He was a semifinals for the Thorpe Award. And just given the social media chatter by Georgia players around him and some of the reporting that's out there as well, it seems like this is a little more real than maybe the last time we kind of jumped on a West Virginia defensive back. I mean, clearly we're going to take debate on a lot of this kind of stuff, just kind of what we do. But in this particular case, there may actually be something to this time around.
Yeah, more differently than, say, Darion Kendrick from Clemson or even Drayshawn Miller, also from West Virginia. You had Zamir White responding to Tyke's original "I'm leaving West Virginia" post. You had Lewis Seen retweet it. So, while, yes, Tyke doesn't necessarily, I think, fill all the needs in Georgia's secondary right now because he's much more of a safety, or more specifically in the Georgia defense, I think a star, not, a metaphysical star, but a literal, I think he's going to play that hybrid defensive back position. But when you have a player of that talent and that caliber and allows you to move some things around, maybe you move a Chris Smith to corner so you can play Smith there at safety as well. I think just adding a really talented player to this secondary, Smith certainly fits that. He has the obvious connection with new defensive backs coach Jamil Adai. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And again, there could be a more talented defensive back to enter the transfer portal in another 3 weeks, and we'll pay attention to that and eat it up like catnip. But this is one where the connections and the on-field play sort of match what Georgia is really looking for.
Yeah, I think it's really fun to follow that. Connor, I know you'll be all over it. There's good Georgia spring practice coverage still to come this week at DawgNation.com. I look forward to reading that from you here over the course of the next couple of days. And, of course, thanks for being here as a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia Today.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, really good stuff from Connor Riley. And by the way, check out his piece there at DawgNation.com. Really all kinds of good stuff from Connor. He'll be on video tonight there as well. So a bunch from him. See that there, DawgNation.com, and on the DawgNation video channels, YouTube included for all of that. There is a lot we want to do before we're done. Interesting stuff from Jalen Walker I want to get to that kind of started a little bit of a conversation amongst Georgia fans in our comment sections when we were on video on Sunday. We'll finish with that before we're done. Let me rock and roll through a bunch of stuff with the SEC through before we get there. So Michael Bratton on Twitter links to a guy named Jake Wimberly, who gives you some college football over-under season win totals from something called the Hourglass. I have no idea what this is, but I'm a sucker for over-unders, so I will give you a few of these here for a moment. Oklahoma, the highest total in the country, at least according to this, for the upcoming season, at 11.5. You had Ohio State at 11. Georgia, 10.5, which is about what I thought that was. They join Notre Dame, Clemson, Alabama, USC, all at that 10.5 number. You have to give Clemson, a little lower nod this year because of the fact they do have the regular season game against Georgia. The interesting thing about these is when you actually see these kind of come out from an official betting house is that you have what's known as juice. In other words, it's a little bit more expensive to bet one side than the other. And in addition to the season win total, you actually get a better prediction about what some of these betting houses think about teams by saying what's it more expensive to do. Predict them to win more than their season win total, predict them to win less. For instance, at Georgia at 10.5, the juice will almost certainly be on the under. In other words, that they're 10.5, but more likely to have 10 wins than 11, if you're following me on that. So that'll be another thing to kind of see. Next highest SEC teams are Texas A&M at 9.5, maybe no surprise. But how about LSU at 9.5? Now, this is one of the things I always say, is that people talk about all the attrition out of the LSU program and all the problems that it has, but the betting community, folks out in Las Vegas, places like that, they just never run from LSU. They are always respected by the betting houses. They were power rated as a top 10 team a year ago, deep into the season after they'd lost several games, because that's just kind of the respect that exists there. I mean, other than Alabama, Orgeron, as a head coach at LSU, has a very good record against the spread, against the SEC, against ranked opponents, the kinds of games that matter. So interesting to see LSU as high up the food chain as they are there, ahead, for instance, of a school like Florida, who only comes in at 9 on that season win total. So pretty interesting stuff. These are the early stages of all this. We'll get more of that. Georgia at 10.5, about what I thought they would be. Alabama also at 10.5, not 11, which they've been before. All that based on kind of who you have to play, the toughness of the SEC West. Pretty interesting stuff all the way around. Let me spend a brief minute on this. Dennis Dodd, CBS Sports, writing about a controversy we told you about last week involving Lincoln Riley, Chad Morris's son, the quarterback who wants to go to TCU, and Lincoln Riley, who's kind of typically thought of as one of the more forward-thinking coaches in college football, kind of more falling in line with the traditionalists and attempting to block Morris's immediate eligibility at TCU because he's not in favor of intra-conference transfers. And what Dodd says at CBS is you can get on board with this now or get on board with this eventually, but there's not going to be any intra-conference transfers at all anymore at some time in the near future. And that may be true, but I do want to use this as an opportunity. We talked about the Morris thing last week. I'll use the Dodd column here today as a reminder that that's not the way that I think things should be. And obviously I'm going to give you my opinions. This is what I do for a living. As I've said before, that if you want to have a sport, you have to have rules. If you don't have any rules, you don't have a sport. That the absence of rules or the unwillingness to adhere to those rules threatens the stability of the sport. And I think that the people that argue for these kinds of changes, hey, let's just have as many transfers as you want, transfer in your conference, everything else, I think they're doing this on behalf of the players. In other words, I believe they think their intentions are good. But sometimes good intentions lead to bad results, and I think this is a perfect example of this. I saw this other story. It was Matt Hayes writing Saturday Down South, and this is a completely unrelated topic, but it ties into this, and that he was quoting Mel Tucker back when, Tucker was at Colorado about what makes Nick Saban great, and in the midst of doing this, he quotes Tucker as telling his players, hey, if you don't want to get with the program and do whatever it is that I want you to do, in this case, be comfortable being uncomfortable, whatever it was, then Hayes quotes Tucker as saying, the transfer portal is right over there. And that's the thing you got to understand about this, is that I think some people are trying to design the transfer portal to be a tool to be used by players, but if you're not careful, it's going to become a weapon that gets used against players. And that's just the nature of the sport, because the roster spots continue to be valuable. No matter how much, players are sort of led to believe that they are more valuable than the roster spot they fill, that's not the way the actual economy around college sports, both football and basketball for the most part, that's not the way the actual economy operates. So just be really, really careful about this. Dennis Dodd kind of waving the flag for this radical change that's on the way to the sport. There may not be anyone who can do anything to stop that right now, but don't be so quick to assume this new landscape is going to actually be better for players. We gave you the stat a few weeks ago. About 75% of the players in the transfer portal right now don't have anywhere to transfer to. Just be really, really careful about all these changes you usher into the sport. A couple other things real quick. So I saw this. We made fun of Auburn yesterday for a different reason. I'll make fun of them for a new reason today. So apparently Toomer's Corner, which is the spot there in downtown Auburn, got rolled. That's what they do. They roll it with toilet paper. By the way, quick aside here. There was some talk last week about Mike Bobo saying that Auburn was the ultimate college town, insinuating it was better than Athens. I would suggest that for any college town, if one of your great traditions involves toilet paper, you cannot be a better college town than Athens, Georgia. Just on spec alone, that doesn't quite work out. But nonetheless, they rolled Toomer's Corner because Alabama lost in the NCAA tournament. Now listen, I'm all for spiteful rooting interest, especially when your team's not involved. In this case, Georgia obviously far removed in the NCAA tournament. My entire NCAA tournament viewing experience has essentially been rooting against teams I don't like, so I'm certainly understanding of Auburn on that. And by the way, Auburn was in the Final Four a couple of years ago, so it's not like they have zero credibility on this topic. But you can't be rolling Toomer's Corner because Alabama lost in the game you didn't even play in. To me, that's just a little too try-hard. That's taking things just a little too seriously. I'm all for enjoying Alabama losing. I'm all for high-fiving a buddy in a bar or wherever it is that people are allowed to be together these days. But the rolling of Toomer's Corner for me, seems to be taking that just a little bit too far. By the way, one more NCAA tournament note. Arkansas is now done and out. And we said this yesterday. It certainly seems true that after all of the talk about upsets and what's going to happen and the wildness of the NCAA tournament, as we get towards the end here with a couple more Final Four tickets still yet to be punched, boy, we really do seem to be very, very chalky in who's actually making their way to the Final Four, which maybe makes for a better viewing experience all the way around, but certainly is a reversal of the narrative that dominated this tournament's early days. We will make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, I want to go back to the commitment of Jalen Walker for a moment on Sunday. And what Walker said from the podium when he announced for Georgia was a little bit different than a very good interview that Jeff Sentell did with him on the DawgNation video channels that by now hopefully you have seen. If not, you need to go see it. In that particular interview that Jeff did with Walker, Walker raved about Glenn Schumann and the impact of all the Georgia coaches, and it was a little more typical of what you're used to hearing these kind of recruits say. But when Walker was at the podium after announcing Georgia there at his, ceremony in Salisbury, North Carolina, the thing that he said in the immediate aftermath was a little different than that. Now, this audio is not great because it was sort of captured, room noise, things like that. But I want you to see if you notice what a lot of our folks on the DawgNation video channels comment sections noticed when Walker made his announcement. This is Jalen Walker from Sunday.
Georgia, I feel like officially the best, their staff, Coach Muschamp, Coach Smart, Coach Lanning, Coach Schumann, all great defensive coaches. It's always a good thing to have a decent head coach. And, I've heard stories of him always helping around in practice. Having a hands-on coach is always the best fit for me. Just Georgia overall, LDU, in my opinion, always brings out the best linebackers and development and skill. But Georgia just fits me.
So as I said before, that's not great audio quality, but the thing a lot of Georgia fans noticed is, hey, when bragging about the Georgia staff and kind of listing off those names, he said Will Muschamp, the analyst, before he said anybody else. Now, as I said before, in the interview that Jeff Sentell did, his answer was a little bit more typical, raving about Glenn Schumann, Dan Lanning in particular, Kirby Smart, but giving a lot of love, place of prominence for Will Muschamp's name when he announced from his ceremony there in Salisbury, North Carolina on Sunday. And it kind of got me thinking about the impact that Muschamp is already making at Georgia, maybe as a recruiter there in the eyes of Jalen Walker, but also in the eyes of guys currently on the Georgia team. Channing Tindall, really good linebacker who's obviously from the Columbia, South Carolina area, a place that Muschamp once called home, also is kind of raving as of late about how he feels about having Muschamp there at Georgia. So in light of what Jalen Walker said on Sunday, what Channing Tindall said last week, also pretty interesting here.
I didn't even know Coach Muschamp. When the first day Coach Muschamp was here, I was watching some extra film with my coach or whatnot. It was like there's a surprise upstairs or whatnot. So I look up. When I see Coach, I was like, wait, what are you doing here? So we had a nice little conversation. It's good to have someone from our hometown here and whatnot, too. So, with Coach Smart and Coach Muschamp, I feel like I have a piece of home here as well. It really makes me feel more comfortable.
So interesting to hear Channing Tindall say that. Hey, piece of home for Tindall, who hails from Columbia, to see a former Columbia resident there in Athens. And, listen, I think what Walker told Jeff is probably a little more representative of how his true recruitment went, with Glenn Schumann, playing a huge role, Dan Lanning, Kirby Smart. But it is interesting to hear Walker thinking about Muschamp and his presence in this Georgia roster. I've always been a big believer that these kinds of analysts matter. Some of them are famous, some of them are less so, but the power programs that can fill out their staffs with these kinds of guys are better for doing so, and I think you may already see some examples of that when it comes to Georgia and Will Muschamp. Pretty interesting stuff there. By the way, we talked yesterday on the show, and it continued today, the red-hot nature of UGA recruiting. Maybe no surprise to you, that's the theme of our Gator Hater roll call and our Golden Shoe here today. Buddy Mad Dog steps up to claim another prize here with a really cool scene of Kirby Smart laying waste to all of his competition there. Good job by Mad Dog, Golden Shoe winner. By the way, speaking of the lousy, stinking Gators, 214 days from right now. Georgia goes back to Jacksonville, gets a win, we think, against the Florida Gators and some revenge. We'll see tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And on video, time now for R.S. Andrews Cool Down, air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. You can trust R.S. Andrews to do all that for you. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. Story after story, they've been delivering smiles. It was one of those nights last night where we did not turn this time of year is always really tricky, right? Because it's warm during the day, kind of cold at night. Last night was really cold. We did not turn the heat on last night. I think my whole family was kind of freezing. I have cold-natured children. I've told you that before, cold-natured wife, and I was probably a little chilly last night too. So it's kind of tricky. Your air conditioning mornings and afternoons, heat in the nighttime. But for many of you, if your systems aren't working the way that you want them to, then go ahead and make sure you're ready to go for all the weather this tricky time of year is going to bring on its way. rsandrews.com for a lot more on that. All right, we got to be quick here today, because we always got a lot going on. So let me do some Facebook comments first, because I started YouTube first yesterday. We'll take your comments, and then we will we'll get rocking and rolling here with all kinds of good stuff. Hope you're all having a really good day. Let me pull these comments up, and we'll be ready to go here. All right, let's see if I can click into this and get going. Randy Hall. Yeah, we're still talking about the Auburn fishing cheating thing. That's one of those stories that'll never quite get old to me. Even if the cheating stuff is more related to like COVID protocols, it's still funny to me. Still funny. By the way, Miriam Martin Corbin, not a fan of Will Muschamp. Interesting to see that. Tennille Calvino says it's cold over here in Mendo. It's been beautiful weather during the day, though. Yeah, it's always funny when I go out west how weird the feeling is when you get towards the evening. Or, obviously I've grown up around humidity my entire life. And so in the absence of humidity, sometimes just normal temperatures feel way colder to me. So I'm sure, Tennille, if I was out there with you, I'd probably feel pretty chilly at night there as well. Because even when I've been in California, Nevada, places like that, you walk around at night, even during a warm weather time of the year, it can feel just a little chillier than I'm used to because when a breeze blows, there's no humidity in the air. It just feels completely different. Scotty Gorb says the snow is melting here in Alaska. Scotty, that's cool to be able to hear. Glad to have you checking in from a really beautiful state, and hope your state's doing well these days as it tries to get its tourism back up and running and everything else. Brian Whitehead asking about spring practices. Yeah, spring practices are still closed to media viewing, and honestly, that's one of those things that I'm hopeful, and I'm not, typically, media guy who talks about inside baseball media type things, but I am hopeful that's one of the things that changes as we head towards the fall, because I think you do get better coverage. And I said before, for me, it's not even so much the small amount of time to watch practice. I do believe that the interviews with the players are more valuable when done face-to-face. Now, listen, right now, I'm not looking to, get a player sick or anything like that. I understand why they're taking great care of the players, and that's what they should be doing. But eventually, in addition to getting a chance to let media see some practice again, I am hopeful that the interviews can be conducted in kind of a face-to-face environment, because I just think you get better interviews that way. more insightful interviews from the players. It's hard to... When you're eye to eye with a player, you can give them body language. You can shake your head yes. You can smile at them. And that'll bring out a little more. When you're staring into a camera like I am right now, if you don't do that for a living, that whole thing can feel pretty weird. Matthew McGahee says, I like that we have 2 former SEC head coaches on staff. Yeah, it's not a bad thing for sure, Matthew. I think you're right about that. Miriam Martin Corbin says, related to some of the things in Muschamp's past, including maybe the behavior after the South Carolina win a couple of years ago. She says, I never forget. He's going to have to win it. He's going to have to go a long ways to win me back. So just keep that in mind, Coach Muschamp. Joey Robinson checking in to say that house hunting is not fun. Well, listen, Joey, I hope you find a good place to live. We appreciate you checking in here today. Jamie Kennedy asked a good question. He says, what's the one recruit going forward you want the most? That's a really good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for that yet. I mean, Kojo Antwi, guys like that, one of the guys I think a lot about, especially given the kind of competitive nature of his recruitment with apparently Texas A&M using a family tie to kind of get heavily involved there. Antwi's pretty high on my list. Yeah, so I'd say for right now, that was one of the names that comes to mind. But when you think about, kind of some of the stuff that Jalen Walker said about Shaw, whatever exists out there related to Walter Nolan, obviously those are names that are big to me as well. Ken Feinberg says, where did Jeremy Pruitt land? He's coaching in the NFL. Is it the Jets he's coaching with? Is it the Jets? Jeremy Pruitt's coaching with the Jets? The Giants. He's coaching with the Giants. There was a Jet rumor for one. He ended up taking the Giants job, yeah. So he's on the Giant staff. There's a bunch of SEC guys up there now. Chase Barbie says it's going to be great to see Smart and Muschamp both throwing hats and headphones on the sidelines. But Muschamp cannot be on the sidelines, right? His analyst role prohibits him from doing that. So he's busy, obviously, in a lot of ways to the program, but you won't see him as that kind of on-field type guy. That's what he's kind of prohibited from doing. That's one of the reasons why I love Kirby Smart's phrasing on this. He calls the non-analysts, he says they're coaching on grass, which is just his way of saying they're able to be on the field, something an analyst is prohibited from being able to do. And there's a few things in college football that have prohibitions. You only have 85 players, you can only have 10 coaches. And so the analyst role has to be very clearly delineated as not a coach, because there are restrictions in place that prohibit you from having more than 10 coaches. All right, what else? Let me go over to YouTube here for a moment, see how folks are doing over there. Let's see if we believes the ruler talking about the idea of a top receiver for the 2022 class. Yeah, I think that's going to be really important. Chase Shipes. Very funny stuff. Green Soldier checking out. Green Soldier, good to see you today. G. Grace Bama boy trying to stir the pot. Nature Gator says to keep Muschamp away from your offensive strategy meetings. Yeah, that's been his one downfall. I mean, like the one thing, Nature, that I'll say, and I'll say this to G. Grace there as well, who's kind of stirring the pot on this. I've always been of the belief that Muschamp's a good coach who's just kind of had some bad luck when it comes to the offensive side of the ball. After a while, you might be fair to say, well, how much bad luck do you have before you finally have to look at the source of all of this? And maybe that's fair, but, I think Muschamp's just a good coach who's had some bad luck on offense. It would not surprise me if Muschamp were to get another shot to be a head coach somewhere, probably not Georgia because obviously Kirby's going to be here for a long time, but that Muschamp gets another shot somewhere else, knowing what he knows about recruiting, knowing what he knows about defense, finally finding that offensive coordinator who really works for him. I could still see him having some success, and that's kind of an unpopular opinion. People have made fun of me for that for years, but I do still believe that to be true. Thomas Van Santa looking for a stimulus. Hopefully you get that soon, Thomas. Rodney Hewitt also mentioned the idea that Muschamp could eventually be a defensive coordinator replacement if Dan Lanning becomes a head coach, and I guess anything's a possibility. And that's the thing about, someone like Muschamp is he has made a ton of money, and he's made enough money that if he just wanted to be a defense coordinator and kind of live the life where he's not talking to reporters and not having to do a lot of the things that head coaches have to do, not getting as much blame maybe for Georgia losses, although I guess in the SEC, coordinators aren't shielded from that kind of stuff too much. But the point is, it is a little easier life. I've said a lot of my friends who are high school coaches, they dream of the day that maybe one day they, hang up the head coaching shoes and just go back and work as an assistant somewhere else. Kind of like what Larry Brown, I guess, is rumored to do for Indiana basketball. That Brown, who's literally coached about everywhere, I think he's coached half the NBA, that there's a chance that he may go be a assistant of some sorts for Mike Woodson in Alabama, kind of the post-head coaching phase of your career, a little less responsibility, still pretty good money, living in a town that you obviously have affection for. It's not a bad life, really. Thomas Van Santa asking about G-Day attendance. No, it's capped at around 20,000. We may get, and I've seen some really good stuff coming out of Major League Baseball as of late about, even some of the kind of the big cities, are a little bit more open, like, the Phillies, for instance, where the Braves are opening this week, they're allowing more fans than what the Flyers and the 76ers have been doing. Obviously, it's outdoors compared to indoors and bigger venue all the way around. But I think the Braves are going to start the season at like 33%. Am I right about this? 33% attendance, and hoping to be at 50% by, June, I think. And then I think they're expecting 100% attendance for the All-Star game. So all of that is a precursor to what's going to happen for college football in the fall. You need someone to go in front of you in terms of increasing these attendance type numbers. So I would say that right now we're heading in a scenario where it is quite possible that there is a full stadium in Charlotte for Georgia Clemson, but there is still going to be limited capacity for Georgia and the G-Day game. By the way, you watch some of these baseball games in states where like there's more COVID restrictions that have been kind of less, reduced. Like Ole Miss, Arkansas, place like that. I was watching highlights from the Arkansas game the other day. That stadium looked just about full. I mean, at least the TV shot you're getting. And a lot of times that can be misleading. We had some of that back in the football season. But watch some of these SEC baseball venues who've really, kind of loosened things up to allow more folks to attend. All of that, if you think about vaccines and people able to do this a little healthier and a little more safely, all of that kind of heading in a direction for Georgia, which could be good. And the rest of college football there as well. All right, one or two more. John Adams says the value of a top fast wide receiver position, one for UGA, is the Achilles heel. And I argue the best recruiting staff of college football suggesting they should have had more speed at receiver. And it is interesting that a lot of the dynamic playmakers that Georgia has in a lot of the groups in the offensive side of the ball, many of them not quite known for their speed. Arian Smith is the one guy that I think you would say is, and he could be highlighted this year. And, getting a little faster at receiver. Now, listen, there's more than one way to be a good receiver for sure. And it's not like the Georgia receivers they have can't run, but the kind of blazing world-class speed that maybe Smith's going to present to Georgia in a full season upcoming this year, that could be something you see Georgia look to prioritize a little bit more in their recruiting in the future. And who knows, the same way that Georgia has kind of trusted its own evaluations for some of the running backs it's taken in, if you want to get that true speedy receiver, and you saw some of this at the end of the last cycle with players that didn't necessarily work out, but it could be that you trust your own evaluation of a lesser recruit because you believe he's got world-class speed. That may be something that Georgia does from time to time, kind of rolling the dice on that. Oh, Thomas Van Santa says he was just kidding about the stimulus. Well, either way, Thomas, appreciate you checking in. Jay Shipes asking about Clemson damage control related to some of the Deshaun Watson stuff. Now, I don't really know what to say with the Watson stuff as of late. Boy, it's amazing how many of these accusations now piling up. And admittedly, and I say admittedly as someone who's, Deshaun's from my hometown, so I'm a big Deshaun fan, even though he didn't go to Georgia. I like him a lot. But, man, a lot of these accusations piling up and a lot of these ladies, seem to be making similar type claims. So it's a tough situation for Deshaun right now. I'm certainly praying that all this gets figured out. But, man, just really weird the way these things are starting to pile up. I was probably skeptical at first, and just given the amount of what's come out as of late, it's becoming harder to be skeptical, to be honest with you. Tough situation there. Tough situation. Michael Morrow checking in to say wasn't expected to win the Golden Shoe. By the way, this is Mad Dog. He's actually outing himself. He says, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to give you a shout out for that. I thought that was a good edit, Mad Dog. I thought that was a good edit. Cody Ledoux, who's not a Georgia fan, says, do you think that Kirby's got 3 years to win a national title before he gets really questioned by the boosters and such? There's zero reason not to win a national title with his roster. So here's what I'll say. I would say that the Georgia window for winning a championship is not closing anytime soon, but the conversation would certainly feel different 3 years from now than it does right now. And that's one of the things I think the media always has a little bit of a blind spot about is that when a coach is not on the hot seat, now at this point in time, I'm actually not talking about Kirby. I'm talking about just generic coach. But you see this a lot in the media of, it's crazy to think so-and-so could be on the hot seat. But one bad season almost puts any coach in the SEC on the hot seat. I mean, imagine if Alabama went 9-3 this year for whatever reason. And it'd be hard to do. Obviously, their Vegas number's 10.5 right now, according to what we read on the show today. But let's say that Alabama went 9-3 this year for whatever else. You don't think Bama fans would be crawling all over themselves to say, Nick Saban's lost it. You got to cut bait right now, get a younger coach in here. There'd be all kinds of stuff. I mean, not even Nick Saban, who's won, stacks and stacks of championships. Not even he would be impervious to a bad season. 9-3 would get a lot of Alabama fans. Even 10-2 in the regular season would get a lot of Alabama fans. In fact, we saw 10-2, a year ago, and it wasn't, necessarily the prettiest thing in the world in terms of the way that folks kind of reacted to that everyone's going to take criticism when they don't win. But for Georgia, the thing I've cautioned folks on this year is not to get caught up in the now or never type mentality, that if Georgia doesn't get it done this year, it means they're never going to get it done. And part of the reason why I feel like that's not an accurate appraisal of the situation of what you said there at the end, Cody, there's no reason that Georgia shouldn't with all of the talent and the resources that are in place. And I think that's true. It's part of the reason why that if it were not to happen this year, I would just remain confident and patient and, willing to see what plays out in future years. But to acknowledge the overall premise of your question, if we're still doing the same thing in 2024 going into 2025, then that at that point in time would become a little bit different kind of thing, because patience is a finite resource. Eventually it kind of runs out, but we're a long way away from having to consider that hypothetical here at the moment. Michael Porter says that Jermaine Burton is his favorite wide receiver among the UGA receiver group, and it's easy to understand why that would be. Certainly easy to understand why that would be. Let me get a few more Facebook comments, and we'll get ready to go after that. Calvin Sanders says that Saban's got room to go 9-3 coming off a championship year, whereas Kirby maybe doesn't quite have as much, grace to be given to himself. And I understand where you're coming from on that. I guess my point in mentioning Saban was that even someone like that, who you would think would be as bulletproof as anyone could be, even he would face his share of criticism if he had a bad season. So, So, Kirby, if Georgia were to have some bad thing befall it this year, Kirby would get the same kind of criticism that any SEC coach would if something like that were to happen. Chad Williams, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. It's really nice of you to say. Tennille Calvino says, is Cody an Alabama fan? Yeah, Cody's from over there on the YouTube side is a Bama fan. John Arena, on the subject of TV, I don't know if he's talking about the Braves on TV or if he's talking about G-Day on TV. I know some people are, I guess if you're a cord cutter, you're having issues with that right now. Is that right? You don't know? You're not watching the Braves. I forgot. Yeah, that's right. Connor's not watching the Braves. I think there's a little bit of some back and forth stuff related to that, but I'm not a cord cutter. I'm sure I'm still very firmly entrenched in my cable bundle right now. All right. Bill Kelly says the 40-year drought ends right now. Boy, I can't wait for that to be true, Bill. Good stuff. Marcinio Askew says he says strength and conditioning should be a focal point this year with all the ACL injuries. And we're actually going to have an orthopedist on later on this week, a very good one, in fact, to kind of talk about the nature of some of the stuff related to Pickens' recovery and some of those issues there as well, Marcinio. So we're going to try to touch on that here this week. Terrence Eberhardt says, hope we can win a national championship with Muschamp on the staff. It'll be like Butch Jones when he joined Alabama staff. That's good stuff from Terrence there. Matt Rugavina says, Bama fans speculating about Kirby shows how nervous they truly are. And I totally believe that. Totally believe that. That, what's the line from Shakespeare about thou doth protesteth too much or whatever the fancy thing is? There is a lot of protesting about Kirby Smart that seems kind of overwrought for someone you're supposedly not worried about at all. I definitely think that's true. Now, listen, Kirby Smart's got to finish the job. He's actually got to make good on the reason why I do think he makes Alabama fans nervous. Younger, more energetic than what Nick Saban is at this stage of his career. But the idea that Alabama fans have nothing to worry about from someone they think of as little more than Saban's apprentice, the actual behavior amongst Alabama fans, including some of the ones who are good enough to join us on the show, would seem to suggest otherwise. Let's see what else. John Arena says the only cable bundle that still carries Fox Sports is AT&T. I don't think that's true, right? I think I'm getting that on my provider, I think. I haven't checked over there in a while, but I need to make sure we're all good to go on that. Keith Folds pumped about G-Day. He says, can't wait to watch these guys play. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Going to be a lot of fun. G-Day is going to be a lot of fun this year. All right, last comment. We're getting ready to go. Back on YouTube just for a quick moment. That guy says the Carolina Panthers are bums. I'll allow that. Christopher Rule says state of Georgia wealth of football talent. There's a ton of it. 2022, no different than that. All right. All right, let's see if we can get ready to go here. Frank Patterson says he's a Panthers fan, does not want the Panthers to draft Justin Fields. I don't know, man. Justin Fields working with Joe Brady, to me, that'd be awfully interesting. Awfully interesting. A lot of good movement around the top end of the draft right now. Difficult to tell where all this is going, but the drama around the draft is actually getting pretty good. So we'll try to keep our eye on that a bit there as well. I mean, the 49ers really drafting Mac Jones, potentially the number 3 overall pick. I don't know if that's real or not, but interesting stuff. I mean, I do like Shanahan, so I would trust his decision. But, boy, that's something, man. That's something. So we'll try to follow all of that. Glad to have you here. By the way, speaking of NFL draft stuff, check out the AJC, Atlanta News Now at AJC.com, and you can follow all of that there for just everything going on in our city, in our state, in our world. You get your Atlanta News Now, including the Falcons' preparations for the draft, Braves opening day, as I said, this week. That is going to be a ton of fun. Continue to look at what's going on in the NCAA tournament there as well. The legislative session for the Georgia Assembly comes to an end. Kind of get up to date on the laws that were passed, the ones that didn't quite make it across the Gold Dome. So you can check all of that out at Atlanta News Now, AJC.com. And, of course, check out R.S. Andrews online at rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They'll show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. They'll get your air conditioning unit ready to go for the spring that's on its way. They'll get it tuned back up to factory fresh specs and so much more. Water heater goes out. In many cases, they can replace it for you the same day. Find them online, rsandrews.com. You have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Look forward to talking to you then, everybody. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.